Welcome to NucleCast, the official podcast of the ANWA Deterrence Center. Each week we bring you leading nuclear deterrence experts for a lively discussion on current topics. Our host is Dr. Adam Lowther, Director of Strategic Deterrence Programs at the National Strategic Research Institute. The views of the host and the guests are their own.
All right, and welcome back to the latest episode of NucleCast. Of course, I am your host, Adam Lowther, and today we have a distinguished guest who I consider a friend and a mentor, and who is, without doubt, one of the most impressive guys I know. And that, of course, is Brigadier General, retired, Krusty Goodfellow. So if you don't know Krusty actually has had a remarkable Air Force career. He has flown B-1s, he's flown the NAOC, he's flown helos, he's flown, I wouldn't say he's flown everything in the Air Force, but he's flown a lot. I met him for the first time. He probably doesn't remember this, but I met him for the first time when he was the new commandant of the Squadron Officer College, and I used to offer the ethics elective, and so that was the first time we met. And then about 3 years ago, we sort of reconnected when we both were in Louisiana, when he had recently retired from Global Strike Command as the Director of Plans and Programs. And he now is, of course, the CEO of the Small Business Consulting Corporation. And so with that extended introduction, let me welcome into the show, Krusty Goodfellow. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you, Adam. Thanks for having me. I'm actually really looking forward to the discussion.
So before we get started to talk about China and technology and bringing technologies into Global Strike Command and into the DoD, I want to ask about one of the things that you've done that's sort of an interesting, and it's not something people do every day. So you had the record for the fastest around the world flight, which, not many people have the chance to do that. Obviously you're the only one because you have the fastest. So tell us about that. How did that come about? How was that?
It's kind of an interesting story. So we did it back in 1995. I was flying B-1s at the time, and I'm walking down. B-1 is a 4-passenger or a 4-crew airplane. It's got 2 pilots and 2 weapons systems officers. And I'm walking down a hallway, and a friend of mine, he says, "Hey, my actual name is Gerald, but my call sign is Krusty." Back then, I didn't have a call sign yet. And he's like, "Hey, Gerald, I'm actually writing a speech for the wing commander for it was the 10th anniversary of the B-1s, showing up at Barksdale Air Force Base, and they're having a big air show in June. And he'd been asked to, draft a speech for the wing commander. And he says, I was going through this world record book, and, the B-1 had set a bunch of time to climb records, mostly, in its weight class. But he got looking through the book, and he says, kind of the ultimate world record is a nonstop flight around the world. He says, hey, what would it prevent us from flying? He asked me, what do you think would prevent us from flying around the world in the B-1? I said, I don't think much. It's an airplane capable of doing it. It's built for long duration flight. I said, probably just tankers, getting enough tankers to get us refueled all the way around the world. And that started it, and from there we briefed up. We got to planning it. I put together an initial plan pretty quickly, we started briefing people. And in the end, a couple of captains. Chris is a neat guy. He ended up he's a congressman now in the state of Utah, 2nd congressional district in Utah. But at the time, we're just these fairly new captains to flying the B-1 that thought it'd be something fun to do. And the Air Force was looking at a concept they were calling the global strike concept, I think. It was the idea that you could take off anywhere in the world, hit targets in like 24 hours if you absolutely had to, conventional targets. And so, it was something that we thought would be neat to prove in the B-1. And in the meantime, set a few world records along the way. So, we made that all happen from that initial discussion in February. In June, we actually flew to mission. We actually flew 2 B-1s around the world. Chris was actually in one of them, and I was in one of them. And so we both, but we flew in formation all the way around. Did it in 36 hours, 13 minutes, 36 seconds. We dropped bombs actually along the way on Torishima Island in Japan. The Pekino, the first bomb run was at the Pekino Range, just south of Sicily. Just a little island off of the Italian coast, and then Torishima Island in Japan, and then we dropped our last bombs in the Utah Test Range. We did 6 aerial refuelings and did it all in about 36 hours, and it was just it was kind of funny, getting it all together and getting the permissions and getting all the tankers we needed. That was some really hard work. All the things that we had to do to get it going, but it was a great lesson to me that if you're willing to do some hard work, sometimes you can do some really neat and big things. And so I've, to this day, it's one of the most memorable things, that I ever did in my career, and just was glad, these are the kinds of things captains still think of in our Air Force, and we get some remarkable young people that join our Air Force, and, sometimes you get to do something cool like that. So anyway, that's the story.
Well, that's something certainly many folks would love to have been able to be a part of. So that's a great story. Now let's turn to a less fun topic, and that is the topic of threats to the United States. And so as you sit around and ponder sort of the decades to come, and as you look at the threats facing the nation, what do you see as the big threats facing the United States?
I'll tell you, I think we're in a really interesting situation in our country today. We're I think it was like 1937 or so. It was determined that the U.S. had about the 16th best Air Force in the world, and Hap Arnold got tapped to I think he was a 2-star general in the Army at the time, was to go build an Air Force. And luckily, he'd spent a career, learning about everything to deal with aviation, with air power. So if there was a guy who had built a new weather instrument in his garage, he went and saw it. If there was a guy who built a new airfoil, a new wing in his barn, he went and saw it. He knew everybody who was doing everything with aviation. He's best friends, as I understand it, with like the president of Pan Am Airline, the biggest airline in the country at the time. So when he gets this assignment, he's basically told, hey, we think, in the next 4 years, we very well may have to fight Germany, could even be Japan, and we don't have an Air Force ready for it. So he starts building, and within about 4 years, he built the greatest Air Force in the world. We still had to, train a bunch of professional airmen. We didn't have enough of them to fly all the airplanes, everything that we're going to do in World War II. So we took some really heavy losses all the way until about the middle of 1943. But we had this great leader who could do it, and some foresight in the country that there was a real threat out there. And, we did it. And, the rest, so to say, is history. The problem we have now, I believe that the biggest threat facing our country right now is China. And we still talk about China in so many circles as if it's, at best a near peer competitor. And I've just come to believe over years of, war gaming, looking at China really hard and what they could do, that they in fact are actually, I believe they're a peer competitor. And, it's really interesting if they are a peer competitor, then the world has changed. And, they seem to, it seems to be happening really fast. So I'll give you, I'm going to give you a couple of thoughts here. So if they're a peer competitor, we've got problems. If it's worse and we're the peer competitor, it's even worse. Because I'll tell you, you do not want to live in a world where China is the superpower and the U.S. is not. It would not be as good a world as it is today. It would be a much harsher world. But we have a situation where I believe that China is pursuing a better strategy than the U.S. I'm not even sure what the strategy is of the U.S. to keep us most updated, and keep our technological advantage over a country like China. So I'll give you, for instance, last year, back in April of 2021, the Director of National Intelligence came out and basically said, hey, our biggest problem is China has a well-funded, what they call a military civil fusion strategy, and everything that they, and everything they do is about how do we take the military and what's going on in the civilian sector, or what's being developed in the civilian sector, and make sure that that's fused in a way that it'll help the Chinese military. So, Adam, this means if you're a Chinese businessman, I don't care if you've come up with some kind of new satellite communication system. It could be you've got some chips that are going to make a computer faster. Maybe you've just figured out a better way to, a faster way to cook hamburgers. You can feed people faster. The very first thing you're thinking, because it's part of their, it's part of their culture. It's policy, it's in law, it's everything. Your very first thought is, how is this thing that my company is doing, how will it enable and make the Chinese military better? Couldn't it be more different in our world? We have companies that are working with us, and their employees find out, they protest, and they stop working with us. There's real examples of this, and they'll continue to work with China, right? And so when I read this as the problem in the DNI study, I thought, oh, this is great. I've been thinking about these same thoughts. I could have written this 10 years ago myself. And then I realized, no, there's a problem here. They've only got a third of the strategy. And by the way, even that third is better than what we're doing in the U.S. Sun Tzu, everybody's heard of it, interesting, a great, a Chinese military philosopher from a couple of thousand years ago. And what does he say? He says, strategy without tactics is the slowest way to victory. In other words, if you have a superior strategy to your enemy, and you're losing tactically, you lose a lot of battles. You're not executing very well, but your strategy is superior. He says you're going to win. It's just a really slow road to victory. But then he says tactics without strategy is just a noise before defeat. And I think this is what we've experienced. I think literally since about the end of the Cold War, we haven't had a comprehensive strategy in the U.S. and how we're going to defeat our enemy. And China actually does. So and like I said, when they talked about the military civil fusion strategy, I realized they only got a third of it. So what they described there is the Chinese will build it, but they'll also buy it. So, I remember I had a neighbor years ago who was working in China and, working rocket technology with them for some major prime contractor he's working with. And, he would say things like, they're over there selling them stuff with the full faith and blessing of the U.S. government. They're going to be our space partners, right? And I remember I'd talk to him on occasion. I'd say, how's things going over with the Chinese space industry? He'd say, oh, it's all dorked up. They blew up another rocket on the pad, last week, and they're never going to get it. I'd say, come on, they're going to be one of the largest economies in the world in 20, 25 years. They're never going to catch us. He'd say maybe in 2040 or 2050. Well, I heard in 2021, they've got like double the U.S. space capability. And it's not 2040, it's 2021, right? Right. I say, and they've doubled us. If that's true, I say, well, thank goodness for Elon Musk, or it'd be even worse, right? You gotta do things. So what did they do? They're willing to buy that space technology. The other thing people talk about all the time is they steal everything from us. Yeah,
that was my question for you. My question for you is, what about the theft?
Yeah, so there you go. So they steal it. And we hear it all the time, oh, the Chinese wouldn't be as far along as they are militarily or other way, or even just technology wise if they hadn't stole it from all of us. And I just throw my hands up when I hear it. I say, please stop talking about it. We have to live in a world that is as it is. So when I'm 80 years old, there's some Chinese official sitting in my living room forcing me to learn Mandarin, I'm going to be upset about it. Right? It's going to upset me. And I'm not going to, the fact that he's in my living room and he stole his way into my living room, I'm not going to even think about it. I'm just going to be mad that somebody didn't prevent this guy from coming, being in my living room. But this is, so it is what it is. We have to figure out how to deal with this. So they'll build, buy, or steal. And I don't know what our strategy is. I guess our strategy is we just think we can outspend them. But the problem is that we don't seem to, as much as seem to spend, we don't seem to be getting the same bang for the buck that they are. Right? They're bringing real new technology. They're catching. They've caught us really fast, is what it amounts to. And we're still walking on the track field, and they're sprinting. Something's got to change. We have to bring new capabilities into our military, or we're gonna become a second-rate military, and the world is gonna be a bad place. Anyway, does that answer your question? The things that I'm thinking about, and a problem. I've always liked being able to identify problems, because I say if you can identify a problem, you can usually get to work on a solution. And I'm actually kind of working on some solutions to this problem.
Are we, as the United States, it seems to me that we're sort of in a position in many respects. If you take sub-Saharan Africa as one example. So the United States domestically, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. And then, Edison invented the light bulb, and these American inventors invented these technologies. And then we built significant infrastructure to put this across the United States. So the telephone's a great example. So we spent billions of dollars installing, hard telephone lines. And then ultimately, if you think about today, most of us don't even have a landline anymore. We just have cell phones. And then you jump to, Africa. And so the Africans, they didn't have, landlines. And so they never invested in that hardwired infrastructure. And what they did is they just skipped to cell phones. And so they skipped all of that investment and then just took advantage of that newer technology. And where we built, banks is another example where we built, spent billions of dollars on this banking infrastructure. The majority of sub-Saharan Africans are able to use apps and store money on their phone. And so they can skip the whole banking infrastructure. And I guess I wonder, these are just two sort of examples of leapfrogging technologies and doing it. It's much more cost effective when you don't have to be, the first mover and the developer. You just get to take advantage of it. And so I wonder, are we in a position with China today in which, because the Chinese will either buy or steal, and then in some cases develop themselves, that they can sort of leapfrog all of that heavy investment that we've undertaken to build these technologies and to put the money into that technology, that infrastructure, that they then, they steal, millions of lines of code from the F-35 or, whatever else they may. They build drones that look almost exactly like ours. They build aircraft that look like the F-22. So I guess my question is, are they able to just sort of leapfrog and avoid all of that resource-intensive development phase? And is that giving them a leg up?
I think, Adam, of course it is, right? And I think the answer is that they've in fact done that. When you look at airplanes that look pretty close to ours, and they're building them in some cases in greater numbers than ours, and for tons cheaper than ours, you got to be a little bit concerned. I remember years ago. This was years ago. This is probably like 2000. I don't know, probably 2007 or 8. I remember reading about this new stealth fighter they were working on that was going to compete with the F-22, right? And of course, it's basically there now, but our stealth fighter. And they were talking about they were going to build it, and they hoped to be able to sell a whole bunch of them, and they were going to it was going to compete with ours, and they were going to sell them for something like, it was at the time, it's some ludicrous amount. Don't quote me on this, but it's like $15 million a copy at a time when we're spending like over $100 million a copy for F-22s. And I remember thinking, man, I wonder if they'd sell a bunch of them to us, and it's an interesting, and I was, of course, joking around. If they can build them for that cheap, let's go buy some of them, because we can never build anything that cheap, right? But it's an interesting thought to have. If they can build 5 or 6 or 7 airplanes that are pretty close to as good as ours. Let's say they're just close to as good as ours. At some point they're just going to outbuild us, and numerically numbers have a quality all their own. If I've got 7 airplanes against one, for instance, and they're all pretty close, even if my one is a little bit better, if I've got to put money on who's going to win that fight, I think the 7 beat the 1. Maybe that's not a perfect example, but that's the kind of thing that we're dealing with.
That's that old saying, quantity has a quality all of its own.
All its own. Yep.
So yeah, so let me sort of take you in a different direction, because this is one of the questions I've proposed and always wondered. I've always wanted to take the Department of Defense and bring in Eric Prince, for example. Perhaps somebody else, but let's say take Eric Prince and then give Eric Prince, a third of the federal defense budget, and then release the constraints and say redesign DoD and make it more efficient. That's sort of been one of the things I've always wanted to do. Now that you've moved from the uniformed service to the business side and you're looking in after looking out for so long, do you see ways in which, because we spend the most of any military in the world, are there ways that we can do our business better and more efficiently and effectively?
Yeah, Adam, I think it's a great question. The answer is absolutely yes. I'll give you an example. We talk all the time in our Air Force about modernizing and sustaining the force, right? We're going to modernize and sustain. And it's interesting code. What it means is we're going to keep flying old stuff for a long time, and maybe we'll put a few new things on it, right? And we get ourselves thinking, we'll say things like, hey, we're going to fly the B-52, for instance. Good airplane, by the way. I spent a lot of time when I was at Global Strike Command getting funding to, make the B-52 better. Big fan, right? But, we're going to fly the B-52 until it's 100 years old. And people say, but it's not your grandfather's airplane. Or your great, in many cases, it's not your great grandfather's airplane. We have situations where we actually, I've heard we've already got a great grandson that, had a great grandfather who once flew the B-52. That's an interesting thing, right? A guy who's now flying the B-52 himself, right? And, but we say, hey, it's not the same. It's not the same airplane your grandfather flew, it was a good airplane, they'll say, and and we've continued to modernize it. But here's the situation I believe we're in. I read a really interesting report. I don't know, probably 8 or 9 months ago. It's called "Building an Agile Force." It was a Lieutenant General retired Deptula, and another retired officer named Heather Penny. She was an F-16 pilot. I think he was Gerald Deptula been an F-15 pilot. And they basically, they basically said in that report, and I think they got it, they said the problem with many of our major defense contractors, what we call the primes, is that they've kind of, in many cases, fallen out of the natural state of technology companies. And what they say is the natural state of a technology company is they innovate and then they produce and then we buy and we kind of happily buy. And so the example I always use, and they say this is very different than modernization and sustainment. And so here's the example I use. Lots of people use iPhones, right? And I'll say, hey, I'll ask somebody, what iPhone do you have? I could ask you, Adam. You might tell me, I'm kind of keep up on technology. I've got an iPhone 13, the newest of iPhones. And I'd say, oh, well, you probably have had iPhones for a long time. And you'd say, yeah, absolutely. First iPhone I ever had was an iPhone 4. I said, well, why don't you still have an iPhone 4? You go, well, because the iPhone 13 is so much better. I'd say, well, what makes it so much better? And he'd say, have you seen the camera? There's 3 lenses on it. It takes these high quality pictures. On my iPhone 4, if I want to take a quality picture, I'd have another camera in my pocket. It's okay. Why couldn't you just take the iPhone 13 camera and put it on your iPhone 4 and say, well, yeah, then I'd have a better camera, but my iPhone wouldn't be as fast. The iPhone 13 is blazing fast. And I'd say, well, what makes it faster than your iPhone 4? And say, well, they've got this, great new chip. And I'd say, well, why don't you just take that chip and put it in your iPhone 4? Wouldn't that make it faster? You'd say, I guess if that chip would actually work and I could get integrated in my iPhone 4, it might make it a little faster. I'd say, oh, okay, why couldn't you do that? I'd say, well, the screen would still be bad. Have you seen the resolution on the iPhone 13? The touch screen, I used to have to calibrate the touch screen on my iPhone 4. The iPhone 13 the iPhone 13 is so much better in terms of its touch screen. I'd say, but couldn't you just have put an iPhone 13 screen on your iPhone 4? You'd say, yeah, I could have done all that. I could have spent a lot of money, way more than an iPhone 13 would probably cost me to get all that work done. And I still wouldn't have something as good as an iPhone 13 because it wasn't integrated or meant to be an iPhone 13, right? And I would say, yeah, you're absolutely right. But what I've just described to you is a modernization and sustainment.
Yeah.
What we do in modernization and sustainment. And so when somebody says we're going to fly the B-52 until it's 100 years old, but we're modernizing and sustaining it, I'm going to tell you it's still not an airplane that is, if it had been built from scratch. We had a time in this country, it was called the Century Series Fighters period, where every 6 to 7 years we're building brand new entire fleets of airplanes. And so we'd say, hey, the F4 we just built is so much better than the F-105. We're gonna replace all the F-105s with F4s. The F-16 is so much better than the F4. A few years later that we're going to replace all the F4s, right? We're going to fly like the F-15E, I'm told, until it's 70 years old. We can't design a fighter we can't build a fighter anymore in this country in less than 30 years. What has happened? Where has that ingenuity gone? I'm going to tell you, it's because I think that there's more money in modernizing and sustaining, and so I don't know if the big contractors took us down that path, or the government took it, or whether they took the government down that path, or whether the government took the primes down that path. But I'm telling you that it's not the way we want to operate. We have to get back into where we're actually making things in America that are a lot better than what we've been using when it comes to our defense. And so something drastically needs to change for that to happen.
Do you think that, it's funny that you should mention that, because there was a time when, take the Century Series fighters, in which the aircraft manufacturers, which there was about 8 or 10 of them at that time, and now there's 2 or 3 that actively participate. So as we've consolidated and as we try to build new aircraft, and I asked, it's actually funny, a few years ago I asked Heather about, hey, why don't you guys, just build new aircraft and then present them to the government. She said, hey, if we actually built, new aircraft series, we would, in the Air Force didn't buy it, that would potentially bankrupt companies because they're so expensive to build. And so it seems to me that the acquisition system that we now have has made it such that it discourages innovation amongst defense contractors, because if they do, in many respects, what you're talking about, their upside risk is so high. And so therefore, manufacturers largely focus on the civil sector, and this sort of the fundamental nature of economics, which I'll ask people, hey, what comes first, supply or demand? And they'll say, oh, well, you have to have demand to then build supply. And in reality, that's absolutely not true. There was no demand for iPhones before iPhones existed. The iPhone got invented, and then after the iPhone got invented, then everybody was like, holy cow, I have to have one of those. I can't live without it. How have I lived so far without an iPhone? And then after supply, then came demand. And so how do we get back to a defense acquisition system that operates, very similarly to the laws of economics, in which you can create supply and then there is demand afterwards, which is how it should be and how it was in the past, in many respects, what you're saying. How do we get back to that kind of a system?
I think you have to bring competition back in the system, right? I think, Adam, you can argue, hey, there's only a few companies in the world that can build, a bomber aircraft, for instance. But this doesn't mean that, that once it's built, that, one of the aircraft manufacturers should own all the intellectual property on it. forever. Because if they do, then the modernization sustainment is going to be a no-brainer. This is where they're going to get the money. As I understand it, the Air Force, when they entered into the new helicopter contract, they managed to keep most of that IP. So as things need to be changed out on that aircraft, if they want to look at putting in new instrumentation, heck, new engines, new whatever, as I understand it, the Air Force will be able to do that. And there'll be times where we'll want upgrades on that airplane. And if there's more than one company that can bring their capabilities to it, it'll be much better. I wondered, how much of the big primes do we need? And most will argue with me that we really need them to some extent. But they get such a huge chunk of the budget for to develop capabilities, and there's very little left for other people, right? But we just had a situation in this company. There's a company, I think it's called Boom. They just built like the first, privately, constructed supersonic jet, right? And they did it in in 5 years with no more than 150 people in their company. And now they're embarking on building, a supersonic airline, right? And they're already taking orders from companies like American for this airplane, and they're supposedly going to do it in like another 3 or 4 years, right? We couldn't do that if it was a military project. We couldn't probably do it in 30 or 40 years, right? And so how can a startup company come and do that? And well, no, I shouldn't say how. The fact is that you got one doing it. I think there's more than one that's actually trying to do that all right now, right? I think we've really got to get to the point in our military. Somebody says, hey, I've heard people say, if you really want it, you're going to have to go with the prime because they'll get you something. Even if it's not as, even if it's over cost, it's late and there's not as much capability than they originally produced, at least you'll get something, right? And, but you're going to pay prime prices. You're going to pay, 10, 12, maybe in some cases, 50 times over or whatever, right? And I'm just not sure that that's the case anymore. I think we need to really open this up. So, innovative, competitive companies are in this fight. The problem is we make it so hard for any company to get into the fight. We do things like we give hundreds or even thousands of small business innovative research contracts a year. Yet large and companies produce great things that actually move the military ahead. But then when it comes time to put them in, get them long-term money. We don't plan to give them long-term money. I always say it's a failure to plan. If you've got something good, you should be thinking about how do I transition this to long-term money. But we're like, hey, we've got another program that already's got long-term money. It's going to kind of provide something like that, and so we're just going to keep doing that. We have to approach this differently, and if we can, then we can compete as Americans. We've got good minds. We've got innovative people. We can do this, but if we don't solve some of these fundamental problems that I think involves competition, then we're just gonna continue to really not modernize our force, and we largely haven't over about the last 25 years. We just have failed to modernize.
This episode of Nuclecast is brought to you by the ANWA Deterrence Center, whose mission is to educate Americans about the nuclear enterprise and strategic deterrence. I wonder if a few years ago, I worked on a modernization study, and it was more focused on how do we fix the acquisition system. And what we found is that there, in the 10 years prior to us looking at acquisition reform, there had been 179 studies that looked at acquisition reform. We knew everything we needed to know about how to fix the acquisition system. But yet, every time a new administration comes to power and then comes into office, and then there's a new SecDef, and then Congress gets on the bandwagon, and we have some sort of acquisition reform, it never really accomplishes what it's designed to do. And then in the end, we have a system that's even more bureaucratized. And so I wonder, how can we, and in many respects, it's sort of the Darlene Drurian effect. If you remember when she went from the Air Force to one of the major primes, Boeing or Lockheed or I forget who, and she, knowing that she was going to go from one to the other, she, drove acquisitions to the direction where she was going to go, and it ended up being a big scandal. And so therefore we got more regulation on top of existing regulation. And so you spend $1 billion to solve $1 million ethics problem. So I guess the question is, how do we thin out all of this regulation? It makes the primes ineffective. It makes it hard for small business to effectively support DoD. And it just generally makes it hard for DoD to get the kinds of technology it needs. Is there any solution for making this a...
I think there is. One of the things you definitely have to do is you have to plan to bring new capabilities on. The other thing is, if something's really going to get long-term money, you always say it's got to get program money, and there's a system that a development system we use in the military. All the branches use it. It's called the JCIDS process, JCIDS. It stands for the Joint Capabilities Integration and Development System. And what you do is you start with this JCID system that starts there's like 5 full steps to it, right? And, the very first step is like a material solutions analysis. Now, that's what will be listed as, you're going to go in and you're going to go in and do some analysis on the things that might solve your problem. But what's interesting is before you even ever get there, before you even hit that first step, there's pre-steps that are like the capability. You'll have to do like a capabilities-based assessment, and then an initial, you'll have to write an initial capabilities document. And then you'll have to go to, a decision point where somebody decides, are we even going to go look at, are we really even going to go do the analysis to determine if there's something out there that would solve our problem? And then you go, and then you say, okay, hey, there isn't anything. We're going to have to build something. And so then you'll go into something called technology maturation and risk reduction. And it turns out for most programs, that's usually like, say a 2 to 5 year process just to, go in there and look at how you're going to mature the technology and reduce risk, because we don't like risk in government. And then you'll go into engineering and manufacturing development, and then you'll go into production and deployment, and then you'll go to, eventually you'll take it into what they call operations and support. And all along the way, there's all this bureaucracy. The bigger the program, the higher levels to approve it. And so all of a sudden, you go from producing new fighters every, 5 to 7 years, let's say every 6 to 7 years, to taking 30 plus years to develop a new capability, a new fighter, right? And, or a new anything takes way long. And so what's interesting is we've gone through, I'll use communication. We've gone through a revolution in communication in the last 30 years. Yeah, we still have trouble communicating in our Air Force. We don't have the most, up-to-date information technology systems, right? Pretty much if you've got a cell phone in your pocket, you're probably doing better than you do in most days at your office if you're working for the military, right? And so my thought is that if we just were able to take and integrate much of the stuff that's already been produced in the commercial sector over the last 30 years, we would gain a great advantage, and we could squeeze that JCIDS process down. So but I don't think we've one of the things my company does is we go out and look at commercial capabilities. So we go out, we say, okay, what is it that Global Strike Command needs? And we work on a needs assessment. Some people, a lot of people call those requirements. I said, we're going to stop using that word requirements. What is it that they need? Describe to me what you need so I can go out and find out if it exists in the commercial world. So we go out and tech scout. We'll say, hey, these are 3 or 4 companies that we think can solve your needs. How about we put 3 of those or 4 of those companies on small contracts to let them come back and show us what their capability can do, and often it's no more than they have to, the satellite, make their satellite communication, secure, or just communicate with a different satellite constellation, for instance. So they need to build a new terminal or something, which, by the way, they can do for like 70, in many cases, 75 times cheaper than the Air Force can do it. And I'm going to say, if you can find those kinds of things, and it's not if they exist, then you can literally start at like step 4 in the JCIDS process. You could get right to production and deployment. You might have to do a little bit of modification, but even if you get there and you find, hey, I've got this capability, I want to get using it really quick, and we can have it ready to go into our airplanes in 2 weeks. If you haven't started working the money into this, you're not going to see money for close to 3 years before you're going to get long-term money. And in the meantime, you're a company that's got to keep surviving. So we have to find out a way that when we find technologies that work, we can help companies actually come in and do business with the government. And we don't make it an arduous process that takes years. When we do that, we will start moving faster. But I'll tell you, I always call it squeezing the JCIDS process. There are some things that you've got to start way back, and it's going to take a while. But even so, the idea that something should take in some cases 30 years to get where we want to be on something, it's ludicrous. This is not the way that America, used to operate.
Well, unfortunately, we are at the end of the show. It's been a quick half hour. And I think the takeaway from this is squeeze the JCIDS process. And
if you can do that, you'll solve a lot of problems.
Well, hopefully one of the listeners for today's podcast will be somebody who knows how to squeeze the JCIDS process and can help make it more efficient. That and
hey, to tell you the truth, Adam, my and I'm not. It's not a plug for my company, but my company knows how to squeeze the JCIDS process. It's a lot of work actually, but if you can actually squeeze it, you'll get capability faster in our military than you would have otherwise.
All right. Well, with that, I want to thank Krusty Goodfellow, retired Air Force General Officer and now corporate CEO, who's squeezing the JCIDS process for us to help us introduce new technologies into the Air Force and hopefully improve deterrence for the nation. And so, of course, what's the website of SBCC?
It's small SMALLB as in Bravo, C as in Charlie, Charlie.com. Smallbcc.com.
All right. So if you want to hear more, go to smallbcc.com and you can drop Krusty a line. So thanks again for being here with us and talking about acquisition and the challenges we face with China.
Okay. Thank you, Adam. I really appreciate it.
Thanks and have a good one. And for the listeners, we'll see you on the next episode of Nuclecast.